The Middle Moffat, page 32. Hey, little girl. I love you. I miss you. So, remember that the kids had just got an organ donated to them. Mama said Rufus would break the organ, but Rufus loved playing so much he wouldn't stop. On Saturday morning came without Janie having had a great deal of time at the organ. But whenever she thought of the way the music sounded in Wolseley Hall, she was confident it would sound as well in the Moffat's green and white parlor. She made a sign in large red crayon letters. Organ recital at 2 o'clock by one of the Moffats. She did not say by Jane Moffat, because she thought that if she got scared, she would persuade Rufus to play, as he was such an odd sight, standing and pumping with one foot and playing, "My country, 'tis of thee." That is all Rufus could play, but he could play that like lightning. She nailed the sign to the porch. "What does that say?" asked Rufus curiously. "This says organ recital at 2 o'clock, said Jane. "Oh," said Rufus, not in the least surprised. "Well, who's going to see that sign way back here?" That's right, thought Jane. Who would see it? The Moffat's house was set so far back from the street that no one passing could see the sign. So she took it down and tied it to the large elm tree in front of their long green lawn. After this, Jane chased Rufus away from the organ for the rest of the morning so she could practice. She was firm about it. "Rufus, go away," she said. "After the recital this afternoon, you can have the organ for all the rest of the day." However, she remembered she might need him, so she added, "But don't go far. You ought to be here for the recital, 'cause I'm your sister." She was a little disturbed to find that Joey had already gone on an all-day hike out to the sleeping giant, and that Sylvia had planned to spend the day making paper flowers for the fair at the parish house. Goodness! She'd better see that Rufus stayed around in case she needed help. In the meanwhile, she wished Mama would go somewhere, for it was hard to make the kind of music that rocked the house with Mama saying all the time, "Oh, Jane, please, don't make all that noise." At last, however, Mama put on her hat and gloves and went to town to buy the week's provisions. Then Jane tried crashing the music out on the organ for all she was worth. Rufus tore from the house bellowing, "Criminy, criminy, Jane," and he didn't come back until it was time for lunch. He really doesn't appreciate music, thought Jane. But then, he's awfully little, she excused him. To tell the truth, though Jane herself was far from satisfied with her playing, even with no one around, she could not get that swelling effect that she wanted. Also, the right pedal had given a raspy gasp every time she brought her foot down on it. Feeling tired, Jane sat back and let the music thunder and swell only in her head. She decided not to practice anymore, but to keep the music in her head this way and then just crash it out at 2 o'clock. When Rufus came home for lunch, she asked him to help her with the chairs. "Who's coming?" he asked. "Well, I don't know yet. But probably plenty of people will, with that sign out there." Rufus helped Jane arrange the dining room chairs in a semicircle. Then Jane picked some daisies in the lot across the street, and these she put in tall jelly glasses on the small hinged trays at either end of the organ. Next, she put on her best white pique dress. She begged Rufus to put on a clean sailor suit. This he absolutely refused to do. Saturday was Saturday. "Well, at least you can wash your face," begged Jane. Rufus did not want to do this either, but Jane caught him with the washcloth and got the worst smudges off. Now it was nearly 2 o'clock. She had been so busy she had not been thinking about the music. She hoped it would swell through the house in the proper way, banging against people's eardrums. She wondered if there would be chairs enough for the audience. Supposing hundreds came, like at Wolseley Hall. If they did, they would have to sit on the long green lawn. The idea of hundreds coming made Jane suck in her breath. Stage struck. That's what she was. Stage struck. She went to the window and lifted the curtain, hardly daring to look. Were the crowds arriving? No, nobody was coming. She should have made lots of signs and put them in store windows and on the bulletin board in front of the town hall. "Seated one day at the organ," she hummed. Nobody was going to come, she thought. But as she was thinking this, she saw Clara Pringle and her little brother, Brud. Clara looked at the sign on the tree and then straggled up the walk, dragging Brud along. Brud looked as though he had been crying. Tears were in his eyes. Jane met them at the door. "We come to the show," said Clara. "There isn't any show," said Jane. "This is going to be an organ recital." "All right then," said Clara. "Here's my pins." She emptied a handful of pins into Janie's palm. In this neighborhood, 10 pins, or 1 cent, was the usual price of admission. "Does he have to pay?" asked Clara, pointing to Brud, who was standing there, looking very miserable. "No," said Jane, "and neither do you. This is free, like at Wolseley Hall. Did you ever have to pay to go there?" she asked scornfully, dropping the pins back into Clara's hand. "Never been," said Clara. Clara and Brud went into the parlor and sat down together in the big armchair. They squirmed around until they were comfortable. Then they pulled out their lollipops. Imagine bringing lollipops to an organ recital, thought Jane. Then there was a shuffling step on the porch. My goodness, the oldest inhabitant, the most important man in Cranberry. How nice of him to come. Jane couldn't say one word. He sat down on a corner of the couch and beamed. Jane closed the window behind him so he wouldn't catch cold. She looked at the clock in the kitchen and found it was just 2 o'clock. Time to begin. She went to the front window for one last look. It was not good to begin until everyone was seated. But heavens, who were all these people? Dozens of ladies, all dressed in white, gathered around the big elm tree, talking, laughing, and screaming. "Look, girls," said one, pointing to the sign. "Organ recital by one of the Moffats." Let's go, they chorused. "Yes, we have plenty of time," said one. Now, The ladies in white were all coming up the path, their scarves fluttering in the summer breeze. They looked like butterflies. One seemed to be Miss Buckle, one looked like Mrs. Price, but Jane wasn't sure. So many ladies, it was hard to tell. Jane fled into the dining room, screaming, "Mama! Mama!" Mama had gone out again. Jane couldn't even find Rufus, and of course, Sylvie and Joe had not yet returned. Only Catherine the cat was there on the windowsill, and she looked as though she was saying, "Now see what you gotten yourself into?" "Uh-oh," groaned Jane, hearing the steps on the porch. She could flee, run out the back door, and pretend it was all a joke. But could she? No. The honor of the Moffats forbade this. What would the oldest inhabitant think? He might never speak to her again. Besides, how could she ever look Clara Pringle in the face again? She had said organ recital, so all right, organ recital. Jane opened the screen door. Miss Buckle, it was Miss Buckle, stepped in first. "Hello, Jane," she said with a brisk smile. "We are the ladies of Professor Fairweather's Browning Society on our annual outing. We see there's an organ recital today, so here we are." To those behind her, she said in the very crisp way she had of talking, "This is Jane, the middle one." "Oh," said the ladies, the ones in the back standing on tiptoe to get a look at Jane. "Well, is it time for the concert?" "It's not a concert," said Jane. "It's an organ recital." "I see," nodded the ladies. "Is it time for that, then?" Jane nodded her head slowly, and the crowd came in. Jane thought to herself, "I should have had an usher." Now the ladies arranged themselves around the room on the porch and some out on the lawn, sitting on their handkerchiefs to keep from getting grass stains. And while they were so arranging themselves, the oldest inhabitant beamed and nodded his head. Bud Pringle watched him fascinated and offered him a lick of the lollipop. Jane sat down to play. Miss Buckle said, "Hush, girls," and everyone grew still. Jane, too, remained silent and motionless. Perhaps she was dreaming, but a glance through her lashes out of the corner of her eye convinced her there really were lots and lots of ladies all over the place. Organ recital, music, Bach. Words that no longer had any meaning for her raced through her head. She finally raised her hands to the keyboard, and she began pumping hard and desperately with her feet, hoping it would be like Julius Sampson at Wolseley Hall when the first powerful note shook the audience. However, she was not really one big bit surprised when she recognized the first few notes as those of "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring." Dude, I am the best at singing. How good am I? Woo! You poor girl. Each note was accented by a breathless wheeze from the tired pedal. The first few notes, though, were all anyone was destined to hear. For as Janie pumped down on the pedals with might In Maine, they gave one loud gasp, and with a plaintive, wishing noise, like air going out of a rubber balloon, they slumped to the floor, exhausted, defeated by a week of Rufus's rapid one-foot pedaling, and by Janie's own passionate outburst. Anyway, there they were, flat on the ground, though Janie conscientiously dug at them with her toes to bring them up again. It was useless. They would not rise again. To tell the truth, Jane was really relieved. However, she was too embarrassed to turn around. "It's broke," she murmured. "Oh, what a pity," said Miss Buckle. "We shall—" What Miss Buckle was going to say, no one ever knew. All of a sudden, from out of the open places over the sunken petals fluttered a horde of moths. They had been hatching for some time in the linings within the organ, and now they all took flight. There seemed to be thousands of them. The ladies screamed. They covered their ears and held onto their heads while the moths fluttered blindly about. The oldest inhabitant just sat and beamed, blowing them out of his whiskers now and then. Brud Pringle tottered around the room, trying to catch them in his sticky hands. Catherine the cat, with a gleam in her eye, leaped from chair to table, pursuing the fluttering mouse. Jane didn't know what to do. She wished she had a butterfly net. "Oh, oh, oh, run, girls, scream! Run!" screamed one of the ladies, and they all made for the door, with moss settling on their hair nets and even getting down their necks. "Save me!" cried Miss Pierce, banging through the screen door, and all the ladies rushed from the house, followed by a stream of fluttering moss. Fortunately, Mama was coming up the walk. "What's going on?" she asked in amazement. Without waiting for an answer, she tried to restore order. "Shoo! Shoo!" She waved her gloves at the moths. Some of the ladies helped by swishing their scarves, but most of them ran around in circles, fingers in their eyes and eyes tightly closed. Miss Price ran and hid in the honeysuckle bush. Jane shooed the moths off the oldest inhabitant, although he said not to bother. He didn't mind them. They didn't bite. Gradually, the moths disappeared. Miss Price hesitantly emerged from the honeysuckle bush. But every now and then one of the insects would fly out of someone's sleeve or scarf, and there would be more squeals and screams. "Now," said Mama when she learned what happened, "everybody sit down quietly and we'll have some homemade grape juice." She didn't like to have people flee from her house. She thought grape juice would make up for it. The ladies sat down. They shook their clothes and they patted their hair. They all began to laugh. They screamed and shrieked with laughter. Jane had heard ladies laugh like this when she went past a house where there was a party. It had never happened before at the Moffat's house, though. Tears rolled down Miss Buckle's chubby cheeks. Even Miss Price smiled wanly. And when they were sipping their grape juice and laughing merrily, Rufus rode up on his scooter. A party! And when Jane told him about the moss, he was sorry he hadn't been there. He might have collected enough to make his own exhibit case of them for nature study. The oldest inhabitant was the first to leave. He looked all right still, none the worse for the experience, thought Jane. And that is the picture for that. And then, "Thank you, mysterious Middle Moffat," he said to her as he shuffled down the path. It was really better than pulling rabbits out of sleeves. Jane smiled at him. Mysterious or Middle or both, she and he were still friends, and that was good. The Pringles left next, covered with ginger snap crumbs. And when all the ladies of the Browning Society finally fluttered down the path with a few last moths hovering behind them, Jane sat down on the top step of the porch, munching a ginger snap. If she wanted to give any organ recital, she thought she would have to study and study and study and study. Otherwise, all that would come out when she sat down to play would be "My country, 'tis of thee," with two fingers at the most, and you couldn't hope to shake people out of their seats with that, unless, of course, the organ was full of moss, like this one. So the next chapter is chapter 3, Best Friends. I'm going to leave it there for tonight. I love you very much. Ooshy Diva. Have a good night.